I'm Becca Phillips, and I'm with Mid-Atlantic Tab, the Outreach and Education Manager. And we've got a great Maryland presentation for you all today about the EPA requirements for the upcoming grants. Um, there we go. For today's webinar, we will be sending a link to the recording and slides within the next 2 business days. So look forward to that because we've got some great links built into the presentation. So that'll make it really easy for you to find. Next slide, please. Throughout the presentation, feel free to type any questions into the chat. We'll also pause between sections. So if you want to raise your hand to unmute to ask your question instead, you'll be able to do that. And otherwise, we'll be monitoring the chat, answering questions live or there where we can. Yeah, and to get started, if you could introduce yourselves in the chat, just put your name, uh, where you're at, and anything else. Now I'm gonna hand things off to Jared.
Hey everybody, I'm Jared Stewart. I'm a program coordinator here at Mid-Atlantic Tab, and I'll be going through some more slides today. All right, so first, what is Mid-Atlantic Tab? Mid-Atlantic Tab is the technical assistance provider for brownfields in EPA Region 3. One of those resources we offer is Brownfields Education, which is part of our webinar today. Another pertinent resource we offer during grant season are grant reviews and assistance with that process, which we'll be going over today. And we also have speakers from EPA, Maryland Department of the Environment, and Maryland Department of Planning with us today, and I'll let them go ahead and introduce themselves.
I'm
Sorry, I was trying to
Martin.
unmute. I'm
Yeah.
Barb Groupiars. I'm the Land Restoration Program Manager at Maryland Department of the Environment.
Sounds good. And I'm Brett. I'm the backup Maryland lead for EPA.
Hi guys, Sylvia Mosser with Maryland Department of Planning.
Good afternoon, it's Craig Anderman. I'm a project officer here in Region 3 and the Maryland State Lead.
All right. Yeah, today is actually part 2 of our grant season webinars. Our first part was called Destination Grant Awards, so how to fund your brownfield project. We have a link to that webinar available on this slide. And that presentation pretty much went over everything you could do before grant guidelines were announced to prepare for grant season. And today's presentation is focusing on state-specific webinar, sorry. And today we'll be doing an overview of EPA brownfield grants and eligibility, going over sam.gov and threshold criteria for grant applications, changes for 2026 with multi-purpose assessment and cleanup grants, what all we need to include in that grant package, other key information, and then general tab resources, and have some time to answer any questions you all may have. This is an overview of EPA grants. They're also referred to as MARC grants, but this year they don't have the revolving loan funds. Again, that stands for multi-purpose assessment and cleanup grants.
Thanks, Jared. I could take it from here for a little bit if you'd like.
Yep.
So our timeline, sorry, I'm Brett. I'm with the EPA. I'm the backup to Craig from Maryland. So yeah, helping him out with the presentation today. So yeah, our grant timeline's been drastically pushed back this year. It was originally usually comes out in September and it's due by November. So everything's a little bit delayed. This is our best guess for what's going to be coming down the road. It's what we hear from headquarters. Obviously things can change and more delays can happen, but hopefully this is what we'll stick with, and we'll stick with that selection announcement in June, which isn't much of a delay at all. So just going to be pushing us at EPA to work a little faster and harder. So hopefully we can get that all done. Next slide. All right, so the eligibility, these are all the eligible entities that are allowed to apply for any of our grants. Notice that there are some stipulations for nonprofits, like the 501c4 organizations you can see at the bottom are not eligible if they lobby. But generally, if you're coming in to get any of these grants, as long as you're not a private entity and you work for state, local, tribal, or any kind of general purpose of government, you should hopefully be eligible to apply. All right, so this is our eligible or anticipated funding for FY26. Obviously, things could go up and down a little bit, but it's just an estimate, and it usually sticks pretty close to this from what I've seen in the past. Our grants are pretty large this year from what I've seen. Our cleanup grant could be $4 million, which is obviously huge. When I started here, it was like $200,000 was the max you get for a cleanup grant. So this is, a large pot of money. And it's also interesting, this is the first year where the biggest amount of money is actually the most awards nationally. So you can see nationally, it's going to be 26 awards for that cleanup grant, which is pretty stellar. But yeah, the other grant types, multi-purpose, community-wide assessments, there's going to be plenty of those as well. Community-wide assessments, definitely our most popular grant. There's going to be 70 of those nationally, you could see, approximately. And obviously things could go up and down a little bit, but this is a good estimate of what you expect to see and how much you expect to apply for. And then yes, with the increased grant amounts, you can see the project periods are now 4 and 5 years as well, which is also kind of larger than our historical trend. So larger amounts, larger project periods, bigger grants is kind of our main goal this year. So this is just a fun little chart to show if you could apply for multiple grants in the same session. And most of the time you can see it's no. But if you do want to apply for a cleanup grant and an assessment grant, for example, community-wide assessment, you can apply for both of those things in one applying year. But most of the other cases, you can't really apply for multiple grant types in the same year. And this chart shows if you currently have a grant with us, so on the left side, if you currently have one of those grants, if you could apply for a new grant. And so, if you're thinking about applying for a specific grant and you already have a specific grant, I would say refer to this chart. For generalities, if you don't have any grants with us, you don't have to worry about that. But most of the time, you either can apply for a new grant or you have to draw down a specific amount of funding, which is 70% in most cases. So make sure you're drawing down those funds if you want to apply for new grants of the same type. Yeah. Now back to you, Jared.
So now we'll be doing a little bit of an overview of SAM.gov. SAM stands for System for Award Management. It's an official website of the U.S. government. It's free to use. And this is what we use to register or do business with the U.S. government. Then you can also update or renew that registration, check the status of that registration, then search for entity registration and exclusion records. And it can take up to 2 weeks or more to complete or renew that registration. So that's something we want to get on as soon as possible if you are planning on applying for a grant this year. This is also where the notice of funding opportunities are released. Those are on grants.gov. And again, if you're going to apply for any of those grants, you'll need a SAM.gov registration. If you're again planning to apply for a grant, you need to ensure that you have an active, unique entity ID, and not a lot of flexibility with allowing applications to submit outside of grants.gov. So again, it's very important that you register with SAM.gov and you also have that unique entity ID. And if you need any assistance with any of that, feel free to contact Mid-Atlantic tab. All right, so to register, check your status or renew. Again, you just go to www.sam.gov, and then you'll need that unique entity ID, your tax ID number, and then a bank routing number, bank account number, and account type. These accounts must be renewed every 12 months. Again, it must be active when applying for grants. You need to make sure your contact information is all up to date. And again, Sam.gov is free to use. So if anything is saying you need to pay money, we just want to make sure we're watching out for scams. Just a warning for procurement. Qualified environmental professionals can now prepare grant applications and be awarded contract to implement the grant. So you would need two separate qualified environmental professionals if one of them is helping you to prepare your grants. And this is again just to help prevent unfair competitive advantages. Back to Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. Appreciate it. So I'm going to go over some of our threshold criteria. And if you're unfamiliar with what threshold criteria is, it's basically EPA's pass or fail system as to whether we're going to even start reviewing your grant application. So it's basically a bunch of check boxes that you have to make sure you're meeting and you're eligible and your site's eligible and your grant is eligible. And then once all of that passes, then we could go ahead and then review your actual application. So this is kind of like the pre-stage to the application review, if you think about it that way. So, and if you are ineligible for funding, we will notify you within 15 days that you are not eligible, and we never even got to your application. And hopefully, you would be able to, amend that for future years. So just make sure you're checking all the boxes when it comes to that grant application. So these are some of the specific threshold criterias that kind of are more important, and we see them kind of falter throughout the year. So make sure that at least you're meeting these couple that we're going over today. So for assessment and multi-purpose and cleanup grants, actually for all of them, you need a letter from the state environmental agency. For assessment and multi-purpose, you need one that says, they're aware of your activities and they're aware that you applied for a Brownfields grant and that, you let them know and you did your due diligence. If you happen to do this in a previous year, you can't just copy and paste that previous letter that you received from the state. You need a brand new letter. So, reaching out to the state again and getting that letter. And all the states are very aware that this is a requirement. So, they'll work with you too if you have questions on that. For the cleanup grant, it needs to be a little bit more specific. Basically, in EPA's eyes, our cleanups kind of need to be ready to go from the get-go. So you need to have that site characterized. You need to have that phase 2 completed, that environmental site assessment completed. And it needs to have, a lot of information about what the cleanup's going to look like and if the cleanup is actually like ready to hit the ground. Because we don't want to fund something that is then going to get delayed in the assessment process and all this characterization process. So you need to work with your state and make sure that the state's on board with how you've characterized the site so far, and that it's ready to go. And if you do need additional assessment on the site, you need to confirm that it's going to be completed by June 15th, 2026. So just make sure that you have that all lined up when you come in for the application. So additionally, for cleanup grants, there's some extra eligibility requirements. This is called all appropriate inquiries or due diligence. Basically, you need to own the site at the time of the application. So you can't just have site access like an assessment grant. You actually need to own the site, and you need to have acquired the site with like liability protections. So basically, you need to have conducted your AAI, all appropriate inquiries, prior to acquiring the site, to show what the environmental, situation was before you acquired the site. Because in EPA's eyes, we don't want to have any kind of thoughts or insight that you might have been a contaminator of the site, because that would not be good for us to give you money then in that situation. So you need to make sure that you're doing that ahead of time. So there are some stipulations, like if the site is from before 2002, before this law was enacted, then you might have any kind of a little out with that. But I would say make sure you're talking to EPA if that's the case, and make sure that you're hopefully still doing your due diligence. Parts of the due diligence of the AAI says on the right there needs to be within 180 days before the property transfer. So you might need to update something before you acquire the site. So make sure if you have a site in mind that you're just doing your phase 1 environmental site assessments on it before you purchase it, because this is probably the number one reason we turn people down at the threshold stage of the cleanup grants. So you're good. Some additional threshold criteria for cleanup grants are the community notification and the public meeting. And these are just add-ons to make sure that the public is aware of what's happening. So for the public meeting, you need to show this application that you're sending into EPA. You need to have shown it to the public, and you need to have tried to get some insight from the public and consider their comments. So, whether that be through, a normally regular scheduled community meeting that you have monthly or quarterly or something, that would be fine. It doesn't have to be specific for the cleanup grant. It could also be in person or virtual. So, there's a lot of flexibility here. You just have to make sure that the public is aware of your application, that they had opportunity to comment on it is the important part of this. And like I said, EPA is typically somewhat flexible with this. So if it's just like a virtual meeting, that works too. And then similarly, the next slide is more about the community notification. So similar concept. It's just, yeah, you have to kind of show the application to the public. So they say here in a local newspaper, I don't know if people are actually still doing local newspapers. I think it's fine to do like a web page or, whatever kind of social media that the county or the city would have is also fine. It doesn't have to necessarily be a local newspaper, but it has to show no later than 2 weeks before the application. So in this scenario, that would be January 14th. You have to have posted it somewhere for the public to be able to see it and be notified about it. And then what that has to include is all those things listed there in the bullets. Copy the grant application, draft ABCA, all those things. So make sure you're kind of going through those guidelines. And then Tab has some really good kind of handouts and infographics about the cleanup grants. You can kind of find it on their website. I'm not going to delve into it here, but it goes over everything I just said with a lot more detail. And has all those check marks that you need to mark for your threshold criteria to make sure you're passing in EPA's eyes. So they have one for cleanup, and then they also have one for assessment on the next slide. So I'm sure these slides will probably go out to you, and you could click on the website links. So I'll pass it on to Craig, who is leading the next conversation.
Thanks, Brett. I'm going to go over the changes for the fiscal year 26 guidelines here. Just so you're aware, these are not all of the guidelines I'm going to go over, but you can find all of the guidelines at this link in this in the red font here. So there are changes to all the grants in the guidelines, and the EPA now streamlined the NOFOs. There's a template in line with the 2024 Uniform Grant Guidance updates. Information has been rearranged into different sections, and please review the fiscal year 26 guidelines for details, and review updated language and requirements to align with priorities such as the Justice 40 initiatives. In all grants but the cleanups in section 2.A, clarification on how nonprofit organizations exempt from taxation under section 501c4 may be eligible to apply. And then there's sample formats for budget tables that are provided in the guidelines as well. Now, specifically for assessment grants, the amount of drawdown required has changed to 60% if you have a CWAG street, and if you are applying for a CWAG street. And then current assessment multi-grant recipients that want to apply for a CWAG street must have the 70% drawdown requirement met by October 1st. And then there are redistribution of your percentage points in the application has been slightly updated, and then there is a maximum points of 155 reduced from 160. For assessment coalition grants, the awards are up to $1.5 million, and entities with open award or pending award for community-wide assessment grants for state and tribes are not eligible to apply for assessment grants. There's previous limitations on entities eligible to lead the assessment grant or assessment coalition grant has been removed. The list of entities that are eligible to apply for FY26 assessment coalition grant is the same for both lead and non-lead coalition members. And then there is a drawdown of 70%. That is a requirement by October 1st, 2025. And then the coalition target areas may not overlap, and the target areas must be in at least 3 distinct municipalities or jurisdictions. And again, the point distribution was changed slightly, and the max number of points of 160 reduced from 165. Now for the multi-purpose grants, entities with an open or pending award for community-wide assessment grants are not eligible for multi-purpose under this solicitation. And then again, this is subject to 70% drawdown required by October 1st. The points have been redistributed slightly again, and then the maximum number of points are 165, which have been reduced from 170. And then there's new changes to the cleanup grants. If additional assessment is needed to sufficiently characterize the site for remediation work to begin, a statement must be included confirming that additional assessments will need to be performed and affirm that a sufficient level of site characterization will be performed by June 15th, 2026 to allow for remediation to begin. This is an addition to required state environmental agency letter for the cleanup grant applications. And then there's also a 70% drawdown requirement by October 1. And then the percentage points have been redistributed a little bit. And then the max numbers the max number of points is 175 reduced from 180. Is there any questions so far that we can field?
Nothing in the chat. So let's move forward, but keep those questions coming if you think of anything.
Hey, everybody. This is Sylvia from Maryland Department of Planning. I'm going to go through, I think, in a little more detail about the grant package. Some of it is going to be somewhat redundant to what you've heard, but we just want to make sure that everybody understands as much as possible how to get through the grant process. So the applicant information sheet, which was formerly identified as the narrative information sheet, is, like you see in big bold at the top, limited to 3 pages. It must be on your organization's official letterhead. It should include whoever the applying organization is, the name and full address, your website link, and then what type of funding is being requested. So that includes what type of grant you're applying for, and the amount of federal funds that are being requested. It's also going to ask you to identify the location of the community or communities that you're proposing to serve, if you do get funded. The target area and priority site information. And then as an option for that bullet, EPA says that you can include a map, which is limited to 1 page to kind of visually depict what the target area is. And then that 1 page doesn't count towards your 3-page limit for this section. And then also not submitting a map will not count against you. The contacts for the project director and the chief executive or the highest ranking elected official for your organization need to be included in here. The population of your jurisdiction, which for applicants who are cities or towns, the population should be, of your city or town. And then for applicants where they're covering a larger geographic area, then, so I'm sorry, I'm confused about this part. I think, yeah. So if you're covering a larger geographic area, then you would include those areas in terms of what you're listing as your population. And the other factors checklist, it's just basically asking you to go through and include the page numbers that reference the location of that information that you might be providing, where it's located in the narrative section of the application, where you would go into details about basically saying how you're meeting those other factors. And yeah, I think we're good for the next page. Thank you. So then this is still me, right? Yeah. The narrative and ranking criteria. So this is going to be either 10 pages if you're doing a cleanup or assessment grant, or 12 pages if you're applying for a multi-purpose grant. And then just to kind of emphasize this point, there's nothing beyond what the allowable page limits are will be reviewed by EPA. So there's no point in trying to submit more than they're asking for, because they won't look at it. And then your responses in this section basically need to provide enough detail to allow EPA to evaluate the merits of your application. And then this section, it goes through in detail everything that you need to provide. So the narrative, which includes responses to the ranking criteria, includes the project. There's these sections 1, 2, 3, and 4. The section 1 is project description and plan for revitalization. Then there's the community need and community engagement. Then you have your task descriptions, cost estimates, and how you'll be measuring progress. And then programmatic capability and past performance, which shows you're going to be demonstrating here how your organization is capable of administering the grant if you do end up getting awarded the funds. EPA needs to be reassured that your organization will be able to successfully spend the grant money and in a way that meets their requirements. So one way you can assure them, there's like several categories how you can respond to this portion of it, but one way is to describe how your organization has successfully administered an EPA grant or other federal grant in the past. But if your organization hasn't received any type of financial assistance agreement before, you can just state that, and then you would receive a neutral score for that section. Then the threshold criteria responses address how your organization is eligible to apply for the grant, and basically how you will inform and involve the community in the activities described in your application. And then in addition, how you'll be handling contractors and sub-recipients if you plan to name them before the grant is awarded. And then there's this other evaluation factors and considerations section, which basically allows you to describe whether and how you will meet these other factors that EPA lists here. So again, EPA will only evaluate information that's requested and required in the notice. So we don't encourage anybody to solicit support letters from members of Congress or include any such letters with their applications, because it won't do anything for your score. So it's just more work on your part, but really it doesn't get you anywhere. And now I'm going to pass it over to Barb Croupiers from MDE.
Thanks, Sylvia. States doing letters of support do not get a lot of other forms that are presented to us. So, this will be communication between us. So the more information you have that you can provide us, the quicker it'll go. You can go ahead and go to the next page. As they said previously, any grant that you're going to be applying for is required a letter of support from MDE. You have to be eligible for a voluntary cleanup program, such things as you can't be on a NPL site or under active enforcement, but we can help you make that determination. We also require, as part of our application to the VCP, a completed phase 1 environmental site assessment that's been done within the last 6 months, according to ASTM standards. If you have an older phase 1, you have to do an update within a year. And then we require a phase 2 by ASTM standards, but you can also do a work plan for a phase 2 if you have not completed the phase 2, if you can't get access to a site, for instance. But our deadlines for times will not start until the phase 1 is completed. And then if you're not eligible for our VCP, you also won't be eligible for brownfields tax credits if they're available in your jurisdiction. There are 14 such jurisdictions in Maryland. And then the cleanup will be accomplished by EPA. I put in there that MDE will request a copy of phase 1 and phase 2. It's not a requirement, but we just like to keep abreast and if we can help you in any way. Okay, so what do we need from you for this letter of support? If you have assessment results, that'll always help us get the letter done more quickly. We have requirements that we have to meet from EPA in these letters, so the more information you can give us, the better. You can submit your request directly to me via email. Don't hesitate to communicate with me. I will certainly reach out to you if I have any questions. As part of the letter, you have to include whether you're eligible or not to apply to the VCP. Again, we can help you make that determination. If you're not eligible, again, EPA will have to determine the remediation that's needed. And we do keep a listing of brownfield sites in the state of Maryland. So if you are applying to a grant, but you're not for a grant, and EPA manages it, we would still like to be apprised of the progress. And we're available for questions anytime during the process. I believe, yes. As stated, you need a letter for any grant application with EPA, and it acknowledges our support of the project. So the more you can tell us, the better. If you have a phase 1, share it with us, or you don't have to, but you need to describe the site status and any redevelopment plans that you have. That will be helpful. EPA says it's okay. We can do one letter for multiple applications if you're doing more than one. And as they stated previously, it has to be current year. And then we ask, to give us at least 2 weeks notice. The more information you give us, the quicker it'll be. So we can usually turn it around in a week or so if we have all the information. And then, oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention the current site ownership. If you have that information, that'll be helpful for us as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Barbara. I'm going to go over some key information. As a grant or a applicant, you will need to complete several federal forms, some of them being the application for federal assistance, the budget information for non-construction programs, the key contacts form, pre-award compliance review report, and the project narrative. So you want to attach the project information sheet and the project narrative as one file. And then there are sample federal files for your convenience to see, how to complete the federal forms on a link right here. And then also the clean sheets to complete can be found at the lowest link on this page. And then if you have previously applied before and were unsuccessful, take some time and refer to your grant debrief from last year. And when in doubt, check your frequently asked questions sheet I think there's a new one for fiscal year 26, and then there's also other resources, including the slides and the recordings of webinars can be found in this link here. Are there any questions we can answer?
There's a question in the chat I've been answering a little bit, but it's gonna be easier to talk about it a little bit. The question is, are there eligibility restrictions with pass-through grants where the funds come from EPA but are awarded and managed by another entity? So I think that I'm understanding the question correctly, so I'm gonna state what I understand and then respond, and if I'm wrong, please chime in. Both if I'm wrong about my assumption and if I'm wrong with my answer, EPA. But it's not uncommon, I would say, for example, say a city or a municipality to apply for an assessment grant, but work with their regional planning council to provide assistance in implementing the grant. We've seen that a lot, and that's allowable. We also see often an environmental consultant or qualified environmental professional who is contracted on a grant to also help with the grant management. So both of those things are okay. The clarification I have and what I said a little bit in the chat is that what matters is the kind of organization that you're working with impacts what that looks like when you acquire them or procure them. And so if you're working under like my first example where it's a regional council, a nonprofit, non-government or government entity, that you may be able to or likely able to work with them as a sub-awardee, and you would include them in your budget at application time under other, in the other category. But if it's something that you're going to include in your scope for your contractor, that would have to be competitively procured, the same as any environmental services that you might do. It could be in one procurement process. It could all be included in the same scope of work. You can do that before the grant or after the grant, but then that budget would be under your contractor line, and you would have to follow all contracting processes and procurement regulations for that.
Carrie,
Yeah.
there's some clarification that what they meant was if a nonprofit has a grant where the funds come from EPA.
Can you say more about that and what you mean? Are you talking about maybe you would sub-grant as a nonprofit?
Yeah, feel free to unmute yourself, Andy.
Apologies for the confusion. No, I just meant there was some elaboration around applicants who may have current funding from EPA for specific brownfields grants, and I didn't know if other types of funding that come from EPA but are awarded and managed by a different entity, if there's any sort of restriction or requirement around that a nonprofit would have to be aware of when applying for this grant.
I didn't answer your question at all. I'm gonna let EPA.
No, it's totally fine. That was my fault. It was a very broad question.
No, that's okay. So I'm gonna toss to Craig and Brett. Maybe I have a thought, but they're the deciders.
Yes, as far as I know, there's no restrictions. Are you saying from other funding sources, like other than brownfields?
Yes.
Yes,
Should be
as
fine.
far as I know, depending on the work, there might be some restrictions. It's probably a case by case scenario. We might have to look at it a little closer depending on what the site is and what kind of work's being done. So we run into sites where, CERCLA is conducting a removal and brownfields funding is not eligible to be spent on activities at the site. So it all depends on the scenario, I would say.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, sorry if that doesn't answer your question very well.
No, that's totally fine. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
All right, that's everything from the chat, so we can move to the next one.
Yeah, back to me. Again, throughout grant application process, Mid-Atlantic Tab is here to help. Some of the different technical assistance we provide, brownfield educations, whether that's training, webinars, in-person events, resource identification, including grant writing assistance, grant review, and resource roadmaps. We cannot write your brownfields grants for you from EPA, but we can help to review those and provide feedback. We also do local brownfield program support. If you need to develop an inventory of brownfields in your locality, if you have any questions on any of those sites, or if you need any technical support regarding the inventory, we're available to help with that. And we also do project development and design assistance, site-specific design assistance, and then design support, whether it's conceptuals, site visioning, things like that. So the important dates with the EPA brownfield grants, January 16th is the deadline to submit draft applications to TAB for review. January 14th is the deadline to submit requests for letter to the MDE. And then January 28th is the EPA grant submittal deadline. And our contacts for EPA, contact will be Craig. Again, we'll be sharing these slides with everybody, so you'll have all this information there. And same thing with Maryland contacts. Barb can help again with that state environmental agency letter. Sylvia can help with technical and financial assistance questions, preparing grant applications, MDP's considerations for brownfield sites, and how brownfields align with their sustainability policy and planning principles.
Hey guys. So yeah, our Brownfield Assistance Program at Maryland Department of Planning is available. Part of the work that I do at MDP is to manage our Brownfield Assistance Program, which is where we work with local governments, nonprofits, and sometimes also private entities to offer education and assistance to help move brownfields in Maryland communities toward beneficial reuse by tapping into technical and financial resources that are available from EPA's Brownfields Program and Mid-Atlantic Tab. My experience here, it seems like the most successful projects happen when we can really collaborate closely with each other and consistently also. Us, MDE, EPA, and Mid-Atlantic Tab all share this common goal of wanting to help Maryland's communities take advantage of technical and financial assistance incentives that are out there for brownfield properties.
Stay connected. You can reach us at this phone number or email. And these links hyperlink to subscribing to our newsletter or signing up for an individual consultation. And then our link tree will take you to any of our social media or important links.